Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, episode 23. Happy New Year to all our listeners. We're happy to kick it off, get started again. Very excited today to talk about DevOps team topologies with my my co-host Tom Kowalski. How's it going, Tom?
Going great. Yes, episode 23. DevOps team topologies, another title, kind of triggering to me. You know that, Adam, how I feel about putting team or engineer around DevOps, but here we are, and we're here to talk about it. So.
The title should have been, if you have a DevOps team, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I looked back, so I'm like, I know I have like a tweet or something, and yes, it's something along those lines. It was something like, if you have DevOps teams or engineer, you're probably not doing DevOps or something like that. Yeah. So that's how I feel about it. But here we go.
I think at this point you're like fighting a war that's already been lost.
Yes.
In terms of,
yes.
So I think we just have to,
it's how serverless is becoming, but that's for next week. So.
So I've got our some guests here with us today, recurring repeat subject matter experts, Jordan DeBeer from Google. Say hi, Jordan.
Hey there. Yeah, I probably shouldn't wave. I don't think anyone can see if they're listening in, but I waved anyways, just so everyone knows. Yeah, thanks for having me back. Really happy to be here.
And the great Kyle Robertson from GitHub, site reliability engineer extraordinaire. That's a mouthful.
Greetings. Don't expect that much from me.
Seems like you're maybe having a little trouble getting into the groove in 2023, Kyle.
New year, new me. I'm working on it.
All right. Like I said, let's kick it off. Last time we met with these guys, we talked about SLIs, SLOs, SLAs. There's a bunch of acronyms. I have no idea what they mean. No, I'm just kidding. It was a great conversation to kick off our SRE series, and so we thought this would be a good next step to talk about team topologies. Jordan posted a great article from web.devopstopologies.com, which really cleanly breaks down DevOps teams, anti-patterns versus good patterns versus bad. Tom, I know you got thoughts on things, so why don't you just kick us off with something controversial?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off. So I'm a big fan of the book, most of it. So it was what are the names? Like Matthew. I have it here. Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace. I don't know. I'm sorry, don't know how to pronounce it. But yeah, I followed the work back when it was a blog, before it was a book, and then they came out with the book Team Topologies. I really like it, what they have in there. I didn't finish it because some of the things were a little triggering to me. They kind of just they didn't really hammer in and say, yes, this is right or this is wrong. They made it very fluffy, like, yeah, you can do that, and they kind of said some things like, it's they kind of gave ratings for things of how you should do it, but there's a lot of really good pieces in that book, and I'm bummed. I wanted to go back and finish reading it, but I didn't get a chance. I did review it, so I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, it seems like the new DevOps definition is like, as long as there's collaboration between groups, you're doing DevOps, right? And so I do feel like I feel you on that, where it's been fluffifized. So, okay.
And I kind of wonder, like, if we, that was like a necessary evil to start at, right? Because like, if you look at I know he has like the rest of like the topologies, and if we talk about like DevOps specifically, designing a team like this, you know, if it's something that happens naturally, you're either already doing DevOps or you're in a bad spot, right? So it's something that has to be deliberately kind of like planned and decided on. You might end up in a good spot, but as soon as you start thinking on like, hey, how should we organize a team? You've already started thinking about how to organize a team. There's kind of like no going back there. So it's something that has to be very explicitly done and thought about. And it's not just something that like, oh, hey, we did this thing and it worked. If you designed a team, you designed it for a reason. So for me, it's really interesting in that regard. And I think that might be why some of the, you say like fluff exists, because it doesn't necessarily make sense to just go like start prescribing something when everything else is, or when everything's so like pre-planned when you talk about like team organization. So
Yeah.
Definitely agree though. It's not very prescriptive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't really hammer on the parts, right? That were kind of the same amongst it, as much as it, I would have wanted it to. So, and I also feel like saying, yeah, you can do it a bunch of different ways, and having these diagrams out there, I think it can kind of be misleading to those who haven't read the book, right? They see like, oh, I can have a DevOps team and it can be over here and look like that, right? And not knowing the fundamentals, right, of the book. And so I went back, I was doing some, rereading on it and just catching up. And one of the most highlighted quotes of the book on the Kindle Reader that you don't see when you talk about these is every part of the software system needs to be owned by exactly one team. This means there should be no shared ownership of components, libraries, or code. And I think that really hits it, but that can also be taken out of context as well. But I feel like that is a major part of this, and having that responsibility and clarity of the responsibility. And I always feel like that's where you start with DevOps, and not having that who does it, right? You can have your team kind of shaped however you want, or you can call it SRE or whatever, ops over here. But for me, it really comes down to ownership, right, and responsibility, and that clarity, right? Having it well documented, right? Having SLAs between the team, right? This is what we're doing. This is what we're responsible for, right? And who, and also that hierarchy of that responsibility. We are entrusting you with this piece of it, right? We may own the whole thing, but we're entrusting this team with this aspect of it, right? And really clarifying that, and yeah.
Yeah, I think you bring up something that when I researched for the show, Tom, it's just like, and as I've kind of transitioned my career to more of a consulting role, when I think organizations aren't thinking about topologies. I want to get Jordan's take, I want to get Kyle's take, because you guys have worked for mature companies. Like you went into Google and they kind of, they probably had it sorted out. You were at Rocket, Kyle, you're at GitHub now. They probably have a lot of these things sorted out. Like someone at a high level really thought about the topologies of these organizations and made it so. When I look at the smaller businesses that I've worked with, I mean, it's like yeah, we're trying to help you with a technical project, but like you guys might want to talk about like how your teams are organized, because that's probably like the root of a lot of the challenges you're facing. So want to get your take. Like, are you guys, Kyle, is there like, when you're at Rocket, when you're at GitHub, is it like a DevOps, utopia? Or, are they still like a lot of challenges with like how the teams are structured and things like that? And I want to hear your take from yours on this as well, Jordan.
Sure. So what I'll say at my time at a previous company is that it definitely wasn't structured. It was structured in a way that like I think that tried to create the least amount of like strife to get something done, which doesn't necessarily mean it was a good experience. And it was also designed, it was also shifted very rapidly due to like, I would say situations that like, it was almost like a knee-jerk reaction. So to give context, my very first role at the previous company that you probably can guess what it is, was a team that was literally all we did was like press the button to deploy something. Like you nobody could deploy their own code to production. There was just literally one team whose responsibility was like to press that button, right? And that team came out of a knee-jerk reaction due to some outage that happened like right before I joined the company.
It reminds me of Lost. Did you ever see Lost, where like they had to push the button or the world ended? I don't know if you. Never mind.
No, sorry. So I think that like, you know, when I first started in my career, I didn't really think about team structure. I was like, well, I just in June I do things, right? But being in like the anti-pattern sort of side of it, like you kind of realize, okay, well, like this is actually sort of important to some, you know, to some degree. Like, and I feel like a lot of times a team structure can be reflective of like like an organization's culture maturity. And a lot of times an unfortunate side effect is like if there's a bad culture, team topology can sometimes be used in a negative way to try to solve that when it doesn't necessarily like it's almost just like a stopgap. And it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. I would say GitHub's definitely a lot more mature. Not perfect, but it definitely feels more mature. And that previous company has changed since then. It's definitely a lot better now. Before I left, it was in a lot better spot. And it's interesting too to see like how it's different between companies. Like, you know, each company operates differently, right? So like team topology changes to some degree to fit how like a company either like needs to operate or like aspirationally wants to operate. Yeah, that's what I got on this.
Yeah, good stuff. Great insight. I would like to hear Jordan. What do you like with your experiences? What's it been like in the topologies at a mature organization?
That definitely kind of like resonated with me, like seeing the differences. Like, so I went from Amazon or AWS to like Google, and they have vastly different, we'll call them topologies and like team structure and like how they organize their teams and responsibilities. And both of them work really, really well. They obviously have pros and cons for both of them, but they're wildly different. So, you know, in the DevOps topologies, kind of like the list that they have there, they have one that's like the Google SRE kind of like team model. That's obviously Google's. We have SRE teams. We do have some like people that are just devs and they really only focus on developing new software, and then SRE kind of like runs that thing, and then operations is a little bit different. But at Amazon, it was almost like they didn't really have SRE people or operations people. It was really just like, if you build the thing, you own it. So in that regard, an Amazon typical like software engineer probably has like a lot more infrastructure chops than like a typical Google software engineer, because it's like, hey, you launch your thing, you have to build the infrastructure for it, you got to spin up the database, like pick and choose what one you want to use. There's guidelines and things like that, but it really didn't operate on that similar platform model as like Google does, and both worked really, really well. It was just really interesting to me to see how much different that they were and how each team like thought about it and things like that. And I do think that's kind of the back to what Tom was saying when, you know, we talk about like DevOps team topologies. I almost think the word DevOps makes a little bit of sense here, because it's not really prescribing a like a DevOps team. It's just saying what the model looks like. So it's really like, hey, how can we have this philosophy of DevOps and actually organize our team around the philosophy? So I feel the same way, that like DevOps is really overused. You shouldn't have a DevOps team. But I think in this application, it does make a little bit of sense to use that nomenclature, just because it's talking about how to organize teams around this philosophy.
Do you think the Google model is the best model? Is the AWS the best model, or does it really depend on the organization? I think
Yeah, 100% it depends on the organization. I think with Amazon's model, you have to be much more deliberate in kind of like who you're hiring and what sort of things that those people should be focusing on. Whereas, you know, if you take a typical organization that wants to like modernize their teams and their IT operations and things like that, I think that maps better to the Google SRE model or like platform engineering model, where you still have a delineation between software engineers and more like operations engineers and things like that. So I think that the Google model is better in that it maps onto most other enterprises. But I think the Amazon model does work really well if you're starting early and you can really plan on things being kind of that way. The real big downside is that you just have to make sure that you're hiring people that are extremely well-rounded. But it tends to work really well. Teams really like it because they can own a product as opposed to, and it's soup to nuts as opposed to just one piece of the product. That they get more clear insight into the whole thing.
What confused me on the Type 7, it's real quick, Tom, I'll let you get in here, but I do want to just, with Jordan, I look at the Type 7 diagram of the article we mentioned earlier, and it, for Google, it shows a circle indicating like, there's not like a DevOps role at Google, right? It's dev, your SRE, dev, or ops, right? So I think some of those topologies did get a little confusing. So I'm like, well, does Google actually have DevOps people? No. And maybe they indicate that with the dotted line around DevOps, meaning it's not like a real team. It's more like a abstract idea. But anyways, don't want to go off on that tangent. Tom,
no, I think that's perfect though, because the green circles like who's doing the DevOps.
Okay, so the DevOps is kind of like it's a joint effort between dev and SRE. Is like doing the DevOpsy stuff. Got it.
Exactly. So my question is what does that communication look like, right? Are there contracts between the devs and SREs, right? Do they have SLAs, and like what does that ownership model look like from product on down to dev SRE? Are there SLAs in between each of those teams? And what's the communication contracts, or what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a combination of everything. So if I wanted to get, some software into production within Google, I could just go build that thing and do it. I could run it and I could own it, and that's my thing. If I want to have SRE support, I do need to follow like a contract. This is typically things that you're going to do just within Google naturally because it's the path of least resistance. Using Bazel, using the monorepo, using containers, making your thing for board. There is kind of a handoff between like a software engineer and like SRE teams at Google. And that involves a pretty complicated process, a production readiness review, it's called, a little bit of like non-abstract large scale system design, and really just like, hey, do we think that you've put in and circled enough things that are going to be important to us for the SRE team to be able to run with it? And there is like an engagement aspect of that as well, where you can bring SRE in earlier as opposed to just like right before your production readiness review, right? So it's a little bit of a interesting model. There is a kind of like concrete handover, but that doesn't just mean that the software engineers are done. They still have an on-call rotation and things like that. And that's part of kind of that contract, is that, hey, you have to have some sort of on-call rotation for this. You have to have code owners and who's responsible for these lines of code and your build process and things like that. So it's a combination of process and tooling and contracts.
Okay, and you guys have tooling to help with that? Because that was always kind of a something that struggled with smaller companies, like the tooling around having scheduling on call for people to own it, and different aspects of who owns this code or who owns that, and trying to coordinate it all and making sure somebody's available if a piece is burning. So is it internal, or is there a tool that or recommend? Or
mostly internal stuff. I'm sure Google's developer tooling is very, very specific and niche. Not much GitHub, sorry.
Yep.
But not much Git in general, right? So it tends to be pretty internal to Google. There are efforts to kind of like move away. I believe like the lead maintainer of Git works at Google now, or has for a while. So hopefully something comes of that. That's my personal kind of wish there. But not much externally, other than philosophy and practices and things like that.
Yeah, documentation or contracts. How does that look like at GitHub or previous employments? Like, how does that communication responsibility, how's that laid out? Or
Sure. So like at GitHub, teams pretty much own their full like service or services. There's like platforms that are provided, and most of it's really self-service.
So when you say
can-
team, what is that? Is that like what do you call engineering teams, delivery teams, product teams? What does that look like?
So it would be like a product team for, like, let's say actions, for example. There's more than one team because there's more than one component, but think of it as like a product team for actions, for example, right? So they have a lot of autonomy in terms of, like, they can deploy to production basically whenever. And there's other supporting teams that kind of own sort of like the different like pieces of like the bigger platforms. There's like a team that kind of owns like the Kubernetes platform that we have. There's teams that own like the observability stack that we have. So like a team consumes those and can work with them if they have any specific like issues. So there's kind of just like a natural, based on that structure, is kind of like a natural overlap of working together in some cases. But there's a lot of like self-service at this point. So a lot of it you can kind of, a delivery team can kind of just do on their own. And then they can partner with teams as needed, depending on like if they're looking to try to do something new or like if they're having issues, etc.
I did see a question in the chat from Brandon. Brandon, if you want to speak up and talk about it a little bit, feel free. It was related to the platform team concept.
Yeah, no, that was just something that I've kind of heard a lot of discussion around. Definitely saw a lot of activity at KubeCon about different groups trying to advocate for this idea of an IDP, the internal developer platform. And I think that you are going to see more and more companies embrace that because just like there's no single programming language that has just taken over, I don't think there's going to be a single way of doing pipelines or deployments or environment structuring. And so because of all that variability there, I think for most places that aren't going to necessarily have a development team manage everything from start to finish, you are going to want consistency around how those pipelines look. You're going to want to have it be easy. You want developers to be able to have very little time to production for a new project, stuff like that. So that's where I think having a platform team allows you to have people that can really focus on how do you implement the best practices, not necessarily, enforcing everything, but making at least that easy path of, oh, you want observability here, tie into this open telemetry module here, and you'll just get your stuff. You need this type of sign off, use this pipeline with these variables, and you'll have, these notifications happen, stuff like that. But I think another point that I was trying to make there, though, is if you're doing a platform team, much like, having a DevOps team, if you're just throwing a word on something but not taking it seriously, the most important thing, in my opinion, for a platform team is making sure that you are treating everybody else as customers and that you are very much customer first. Because I was in a role in the past, a few jobs ago, where I was on a platform team and we were dictating to people, hey, we've got this great pipeline. You should totally get on board. By the way, this is the way you have to do, application configuration. And it was so foreign to everybody. Everybody hated it. But if there would have been that, just a step back for a moment, consider your customers and what their needs are, what their goals are, it could have gone a completely different direction, would have been much easier, much better overall, and honestly, probably a lot less work.
So I have to ask the same question. How do you do the documentation? Do you have like how do you bring that culture, right? That culture change? Like how did that happen where it was, dictatorship versus, treating them as a customer? Was there, good documentation? Did you have support from the top down? Like how did that look? Because I've struggled with that, right? And yeah, for me, yeah, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah. Well, honestly, the problem in the beginning was the top down. There was a person in a key leadership role, one of the C-level people who very, very high ego, thought that they could do everything better. Like lots of choices were made around that concept. Like if HashiCorp was in the name of any technology, they didn't want to use it because, well, if they can do it, we can do it, and we can do it better. So there was a lot of ego driving things. And so with that same mindset, it was, I'm going to design this configuration management system, and it's going to be the best the world has ever seen. And you're just going to do it this way, and you're going to love it. And it ended up just being a lot of ego driven stuff that did not take other people into consideration at all. And so during that time, I personally spent a lot of time just kind of trying to level the waves, trying to help people and trying to make it easier for them to use the stuff that we were kind of being forced to use at the time, trying to help through educating, through adding additional tooling to allow things to be easier. But in the end, the thing that really made the difference there was when the couple people who had those big egos trying to drive everything ended up leaving. Then all of a sudden you saw just this like sigh of relief from everybody. And all of a sudden it was, okay, let's do this the way that we want to do. And by that point in time, I think it was very easy to get the momentum because I'd already spent that time relationship building. We all knew we were all on the same page. And so all of a sudden it was, okay, we can all now go in the same direction. Mm-hmm. And so that was a good change there. And then we took that momentum, capitalized on it, and until the time that I left.
I did want to, I think the platform team is kind of a buzz, a new buzz team, right? Like I think, DevOps isn't working, so let's create a platform team. I think people think of it as a quick way to centralize something. It's like, we don't have enough DevOps people to put on every delivery team, so let's just create a platform team. And I think what it's important is if you're going to establish a platform team is like, you should have some sense of what the platform is, like, right? Like, what is it like? I mean, I guess you can start from ground zero, but and you want to be customer centric, but you can't realistically build a custom hot rod for every delivery team. So there has to be some consistency. And, I think that's when we get into like, what's the difference between an enablement team versus a platform team? Whereas an enablement team might be a better way to start. And then once you kind of fleshed out what you want to do across the org, maybe that transitions into a platform team. But I'm always leery of kind of going centralized, especially in a small org, because I think you just kind of you start creating those silos, and then it becomes canon for the org. This is the way we do it, and then the change becomes exponentially harder to make. And Brandon, you just gave a great example of how good intentions were probably in mind all throughout that, but just all it takes is one ego-driven executive to kind of really cause pain throughout the whole org. So really interesting concepts though about platform teams versus DevOps team versus embedded versus build versus buy. That's a whole nother show right there. We should do a show on build versus buy.
The names really matter, right? With the DevOps, the serverless. I like calling it an enablement team, right? That's if that's what you're doing, right? Yeah, it's best to portray that right across the organization and helping that culture of we're just enabling, right? Not this is the platform, you have to do it, right? Which I think it can come with that connotation. So
I think if you're sorry, go ahead.
I think if you're giving teams responsibility, you're also empowering them to say no. And I think that's like the most crucial part about building a platform team is that like if you're forcing everyone to use it, you're not building a platform. You're building kind of like the infrastructure that everyone has to use. You're the infrastructure team. I think that's the kind of the linchpin or the keystone of a platform team, right? Teams have to be able to say no. If you're going to give them responsibility, I think that's the biggest thing that the biggest kind of like veto card that you're giving them, or the biggest, most powerful tool, the ability to say no. And I think that has a natural kind of effect on making your platform teams more customer focused.
Yeah, agreed. This made me think of like an anecdote that I have, like, and I think it kind of goes into like, it involves a platform team, but it also kind of involves sort of like where there's like ambiguity on responsibility between teams. So before I had left Rockets, there had been a platform team like kind of sort of created to work on their Kubernetes platform. And like, I honestly love working with the team, really smart guys, or really smart people. And they were really like customer focused. They were like trying to understand what like everybody else was like, what the problems were with like the current state, and like trying to, understand and make things better. But the problem was there was a bit of shit. Like they were kind of also looking at like the deployment side of things when there was already another team that owned a deployment platform and in its life and like features, etc. So there was like this ambiguity on ownership of deployment, and it caused a lot of rift because there was really two separate ways to do everything. So you had a split of some groups using one way, some groups using another way, and then when the other way would add a new feature, the first way people would want that same feature when it may have not made sense for them for whatever reason. So it created this like sort of rift where like there was never an ideal solution for anything. And I think it, for me, illustrated the importance of having like clear sort of like boundaries of responsibility of like, hey, like we're going to own this sort of like feature, let's say deployments, right? So like there's a consistent experience, consistent sort of like life cycle, consistent like product updates, etc. We don't have this like sort of like fragmented sort of like experience, and it just makes it harder for everybody.
Sure.
It's not. That's the other thing too in the book, right? It says that the ownership of code components, things like that. It's really, more importantly, the ownership of the customer value and that segment, right? Whether external or internal, and really defining that. This is the value that we bring to our customers, and having contract SLA, whatever, right? Getting rid of that ambiguity. I think that's the biggest thing to me. Yeah.
How do companies, big companies like AWS, Microsoft, GitHub, how do they know when to evolve their topology? Are they so mature that they're set in their ways, or does a place like Google once a year like sit down and have like a personal reflection time and think about how we can evolve, or are we always evolving the process as just part of Agile and thinking about how topologies could change?
That's a really good question. I definitely think like, if you looked at like Google, Amazon, probably Microsoft, or like any of these like big companies, it's much harder to change like organizations as opposed to the certain processes that make up how we think about that sort of thing. I would love to say like, oh yeah, both like Google and Amazon like are constantly like evaluating. And I do think that they evaluate like individual processes, but I think once a company adopts a philosophy, it really takes a huge amount, especially like more established companies, it takes a huge amount of like thought leadership in order to like either course correct or just change courses and things like that. A great example of this maybe is actually like kind of Microsoft. They went from, the kind of the way of like IBM or Oracle. They were becoming this old like stodgy like tech company. But the new CEO came in, and it was just the amount of like course correcting that I think they did there. I don't know how that reflects internally, but I think it's really, really hard to steer these big companies like that. And while they do evaluate individual processes, I definitely don't think that, Google's reevaluating SRE on a yearly basis. It's like a concept or a philosophy or an implementation of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say as like more stakeholders get involved, it's harder and harder to make those large course corrections. I would say so far, like my experience at GitHub is like there's been individual small changes. Like if they find in a certain subsect there's a need to like shift things a bit, that can be done. But like looking at a bigger picture, so far I have not seen anything like that. But I will say is at Rocket there was a lot more often change in topology as things evolved, because things evolved very rapidly when like the mortgage industry was like really hot. So there was a lot of rapid change based on like the number of people being employed, like the requirements of the systems. and like where those boundaries were. So there was often like topology change to shift so that like things that were related were closer together. So there was more collaboration, moving things as needed to help grow the business more rapidly, so that the right people were closer together.
Right. Yeah. Really interesting stuff. I could talk about it all day, I think.
Yeah. I
well,
will
this
be
has been
talking about it. A slight plug coming up. I don't know the date.
January 18th.
January 18th. I will be talking about DevOps and my takes on it, and then also AWS implementation and how it can hurt, hinder or help your DevOps journey. So join us then. I think here we're gonna have it in this Discord. It'll be aired right in the Discord. It's gonna be live, but you can join in the Discord and
live
ask
streamed
questions.
on gltl.tv and
Yes.
also right here on our Discord. So yeah, feel free to come and watch Tom Kowalski present at the Michigan AWS Meetup group. So on that
Tom,
note, go ahead.
I was gonna say, Tom, will you wish me a happy birthday if I go?
Sure.
My birthday's the
Shout out.
18th.
Yes. Well, we'll celebrate.
Nice.
Make
All right,
everyone
sounds
sing
good.
happy birthday to him. That'll be super embarrassing for everyone.
I want to give a thanks to Jordan, to Kyle, my co-host Tom.
Thank you.
Audience participation. Thank you, Brennan, for giving some great insights. Another great episode today. Excited to see our next talk with our SRE crew. Not sure when we don't have one planned, but we'll get it out there. And yeah, that's it for today. Thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
You too.